Cadsuane's defiance of the White Tower was only the beginning. Her greatest battle was not against the Aes Sedai hierarchy, but against the madness of the Dragon Reborn. For months, Rand had been slipping further and further into the grip of Lews Therin's madness, the taint on the male half of the One Power eating away at his mind and his soul. He was angry, he was paranoid, and he was convinced that everyone around him was either going to betray him or use him for their own gain. He had pushed away his friends, his allies, and the women who loved him, and he was on the verge of becoming the very thing the world feared the most, a mad Dragon Reborn, who would destroy everything in his path. The White Tower had no answer for this madness. They had only their rules, their protocol, and their desire to control him. Cadsuane had an answer. It was not a gentle one. It was not a kind one. And it was not one that anyone else would have dared to use. It was arrogance pure, an unadulterated arrogance weaponized into a form of psychological warfare that was the only thing capable of piercing the dragon's hardening madness. Cadsuane's internal defiance of the White Tower had prepared her for this moment for years. She had defied the Tower's authority, she had rejected their rules, and she had stood her ground against the most powerful Aes Sedai in the world. That same defiance, that same unshakable self-confidence, that same arrogance was now turned outward toward Rand al'Thor, and it was the perfect tool for saving him. Because Rand al'Thor was drowning in his own arrogance, his own power, and his own sense of invincibility. He was the Dragon Reborn, the most powerful channel in the world, the savior of the world, and he believed that he could handle everything on his own, that he did not need anyone's help, that he did not have to answer to anyone. That arrogance was fueling his madness. It was making him blind to his own flaws, his own fears, and his own humanity. And the only way to break through that arrogance to reach the boy beneath the dragon was to meet it with an even greater arrogance, an arrogance that Rand could not, an arrogance that forced him to face himself. Cadsuane's methodology for saving Rand was simple in its brutality. She refused to bow to him, she refused to fear him, and she refused to let him hide behind his title as the Dragon Reborn. She treated him not as a savior, not as a god, and not as a weapon, but as a boy, a flawed and broken boy who needed to be taught a lesson. She used her arrogance to challenge him at every turn, to confront him with his mistakes, and to force him to acknowledge his own humanity. She did not coddle him, she did not comfort him, and she did not tell him what he wanted to hear. She told him the truth, the hard and unvarnished truth, and she did it with a confidence and a swagger that made Rand seethe with anger. And that anger was exactly what Cadsuane wanted, because anger was better than madness. Anger was a human emotion, and it was a start. Cadsuane inflicted a series of brutal lessons on Rand, lessons that were designed to strip away his arrogance, his invincibility, and his belief that he was above everyone else. One of the first lessons came when Rand tried to order her around, when he tried to use his power as the Dragon Reborn to make her do his bidding. Cadsuane did not just refuse him, she mocked him. She told him that his title meant nothing to her, that his power was impressive, but not unbeatable, and that he was not the boss of her. He channeled the One Power in a display of strength that matched his own, and she made it clear that she was not afraid of him, that she could take him in a fight, and that he would do well to treat her with respect. Rand was furious. He was used to everyone bowing to him, to everyone fearing him, to everyone doing exactly what he said. But Cadsuane did not bow, she did not fear, and she did not obey. And in that moment, Rand was forced to see her not as just another Aes Sedai, but as an equal, a force to be reckoned with. And that was the first crack in his armor of arrogance. Another lesson came when Rand made a mistake that cost innocent lives, a mistake that he tried to brush off as an unavoidable consequence of war. Cadsuane did not let him brush it off. She confronted him. She told him that his power came with a responsibility to value human life, a responsibility to think before he acted, and a responsibility to acknowledge his mistakes. She did not let him hide behind the excuse of the Dragon Reborn's curse. She did not let him blame Lews Therin, or the taint, or the shadow. She made him take responsibility for his actions, and that responsibility was a heavy burden, a burden that forced him to confront his own humanity. Cadsuane's lessons were not just about stripping away Rand's arrogance, they were about prioritizing his emotional stability over his political power. The White Tower and Rand's own allies were so focused on his political power, on what he could do to win the war, on how he could unite the nations of the world, that they forgot about his emotional well-being. They saw him as a weapon, a tool, a savior, but they did not see him as a boy who was struggling to hold onto his mind and his soul. Cadsuane, however, saw nothing else. She knew that without emotional stability, Rand's political power was useless, that a mad Dragon Reborn could not unite the nations, could not win the war, and could not save the world. She knew that the only way for Rand to be an effective leader was for him to first be a human being, who could feel guilt, regret, and compassion, a human being who could connect with the people he was supposed to save. So she put his emotional stability first. She put his humanity first. And she did whatever it took to make sure that he held on to that humanity, even if it meant being cruel, even if it meant being arrogant, even if it meant making him hate her. Cadsuane's specific brand of cruelty was the only tool capable of piercing the dragon's hardening madness, because it was the only tool that could reach the boy beneath the power. Every other person in Rand's life either loved him, feared him, or wanted to use him. His friends loved him, and they tried to comfort him, but they could not bring themselves to challenge him, to make him face his mistakes. His allies feared him, and they tried to obey him, but they could not stand up to him to make him see his own flaws. The Aes Sedai wanted to use him, and they tried to control him, but they could not connect with him to make him hold onto his humanity. Only Cadsuane was able to do all of these things because she did not love him, she did not fear him, and she did not want to use him. She only wanted to save him, and she was willing to be cruel to do it. Her cruelty was not born of malice, it was born of necessity. It was the cruelty of a teacher who has to discipline a student to make them better, the cruelty of a warrior who has to strike a blow to disable an enemy, the cruelty of a savior who has to do whatever it takes to save the world. She knew that Rand's madness was a wall, a thick and impenetrable wall that had been built by his arrogance, his power, and his fear. And the only way to break through that wall was with a sledgehammer of arrogance and cruelty that no one else had the courage to wield. Cadsuane's psychological warfare worked. Slowly but surely Rand's madness began to recede. His anger at Cadsuane turned into respect, his paranoia turned into trust, and his arrogance turned into humility. He began to connect with his friends and his allies again. He began to feel compassion for the people he was supposed to save, and he began to hold on to his humanity with a death grip. He still had the taint on his mind. He still heard the whispers of Lews Therin, and he still had a long road ahead of him, but he was no longer slipping into madness. He was no longer the mad dragon reborn, he was Rand al'Thor, a boy, a human being, a savior who was learning to handle the weight of his fate. And it was all because Cadsuane Melaidhrin had weaponized her arrogance against him, had used her cruelty to pierce his madness, and had put his emotional stability above everything else. She had fought the greatest battle of her life, not with the one power, not with a sword, but with her words, her confidence, and her unshakable will. And she had won. She had saved the Dragon Reborn, and in doing so, she had saved the world. But the cost of that victory would be felt for years to come, and the consequences of her psychological warfare would ripple through Rand's life and through the lives of everyone around him. For now, however, Rand al'Thor was alive, and he was sane, and that was all that mattered. That was all that Cadsuane had ever wanted. Cadsuane did not just fight to save the Dragon Reborn, she fought to tear down the very foundation of how Aes Sedai see themselves and their place in the White Tower. For centuries, the Aes Sedai had ranked themselves by two unbreakable rules: age and strength in the One Power. The older an Aes Sedai was, the higher her rank, the stronger she was in the One Power, the more respect she was given. A sister who was 200 years old was automatically superior to a sister who was 100 years old, no matter how talented the younger sister was. A sister who could channel the One Power with great strength was automatically given more authority than a sister with lesser strength, no matter how wise or capable the weaker sister was. This hierarchy of age and strength was the bedrock of the White Tower. It was the first thing every novice and accepted was taught, and it was a system that no one dared to challenge. Until Cadsuane Melaidhrin. After saving Rand al'Thor from his madness, Cadsuane turned her attention back to the White Tower, and she set about shattering the hierarchy of age and strength with the same brutality and the same unshakable will that she had used to save the Dragon Reborn. She did not just question this hierarchy, she subverted it. She mocked it, and she rendered it meaningless with every word and every action. She treated the most senior sitters and high-ranking sisters in the White Tower like unruly children. She dismissed their wisdom, their age, and their strength, and she proved that power and age are secondary to force of will. In doing so, she inflicted a wound on the White Tower's infrastructure that would never fully heal, a wound that exposed the emptiness of the Aes Sedai's ranking system, and that forced the sisters to confront a painful truth. Their age and their strength did not make them better, it just made them older and stronger. Cadsuane's subversion of the Aes Sedai's ranking system began the moment she stepped foot back into the White Tower, and it was on full display in every interaction she had with the Tower's most powerful sisters. She would walk into the hall of the Tower where the sitters, the most senior and most respected sisters in the White Tower, gathered, and she would interrupt their debates without a second thought. She would speak over sisters who were twice her age. She would contradict sisters who were stronger in the One Power than she was, and she would tell them that their opinions were worthless, their debates were pointless, and their rank meant nothing to her. She did not care that a sitter was 300 years old. She did not care that a high-ranking sister could channel the One Power with a strength that few could match. She only cared about one thing: whether they had the will and the courage to do what was necessary to fight the shadow. If they did, she would work with them. If they did not, she would dismiss them like a child who had thrown a tantrum. One of the most memorable examples of this came when Cadsuane confronted a group of sitters who had been debating for weeks about whether to send Aes Sedai to aid Rand in the war against the shadow. The sitters had been arguing about rank, about who should lead the mission, about which sisters had the right to work with the Dragon Reborn, and they had made no progress. Cadsuane walked into the hall, stood in the center of the room, and told them that they were wasting their time, that their debates were nothing more than childish squabbling, and that they needed to stop worrying about their rank and start worrying about the world. She pointed to a young sister in the room, a sister who was only 50 years old, and who was not particularly strong in the One Power, but who had spent years fighting Trollocs on the borderlands. Cadsuane told the sitters that this young sister was more qualified to lead the mission than any of them, because she had the will to fight, the courage to act, and the experience to survive. She told them that the young sister's age and strength meant nothing compared to her character and her resolve, and she ordered the sitters to give the young sister their full support. The sitters were furious. They were insulted. They were convinced that Cadsuane had crossed a line by elevating a young and weak sister above them, but they could do nothing about it. Cadsuane's will was unshakable, her power was undeniable, and her reputation as a living legend made her untouchable. The young sister was given the mission, and she led it with great success, saving hundreds of lives and aiding Rand in a crucial battle against the shadow. It was a victory that proved Cadsuane's point age and strength are not the measures of a great Aes Sedai will and courage are. Cadsuane's treatment of the sitters and high-ranking sisters was not just an act of insolence. It was a deliberate attempt to render their traditional rank meaningless. She wanted the Aes Sedai to see that their ranking system was a farce, a system that rewarded age and strength over ability and character, a system that had made them complacent and weak. She wanted them to see that a sister's worth was not determined by how long she had lived, or how much power she could wield, but by what she did, by how she fought, by how she lived up to the Aes Sedai's sacred duty to protect the world. And she did this by making the traditional rank of the sitters and high-ranking sisters irrelevant. If a sitter's rank could not make Cadsuane respect her, if a high-ranking sister's strength could not make Cadsuane obey her, then what was the point of rank at all? Cadsuane's actions had a profound and long-term effect on the White Tower's infrastructure. They shattered the bedrock of the Aes Sedai's identity, and they forced the tower to confront the flaws in its ranking system. For centuries, the White Tower had been a rigid and hierarchical institution where every sister knew her place and where no one dared to step outside of it. This rigidity had given the tower a sense of order and stability, but it had also made it slow to act, complacent, and unable to adapt to change. Cadsuane's shattering of the hierarchy of age and strength broke that rigidity. It shook the tower to its core, and it created a sense of chaos that many sisters found terrifying. But it also created an opportunity for the White Tower to evolve, an opportunity to create a new ranking system, a system that rewarded ability, character, and will instead of age and strength. The long-term damage to the tower's infrastructure was significant. Many of the senior sisters refused to accept the change. They clung to the old ways they plotted against Cadsuane, and they tried to rebuild the hierarchy that she had shattered. This infighting weakened the White Tower. It made it harder for the Aes Sedai to unite against the shadow, and it created a split within the tower that would last for years. Some sisters supported Cadsuane. They believed that her changes were necessary, and that the White Tower needed to evolve to survive. Other sisters opposed her. They believed that she was a rebel who was destroying the White Tower's legacy, and that the old ways were the only ways. This split made the White Tower less effective, less united, and less able to fight the shadow. But it was a necessary damage, a damage that came with progress. Because Cadsuane proved that the White Tower's old infrastructure was not just flawed, it was unsustainable. It was a system that had been built for a different world, a world where the shadow was not an immediate threat, a world where the Aes Sedai could afford to bicker over rank and protocol. But the world had changed. The shadow was at the gates, the Dragon Reborn had returned, and the White Tower could no longer afford to cling to the old ways. Cadsuane's shattering of the hierarchy of age and strength was a wake-up call that forced the White Tower to realize that it had to change or die. She proved that power and age are secondary to force of will, that a sister's worth is not determined by her rank, but by her actions, and that the White Tower's greatest strength is not its hierarchy, but its sisters, the women who wield the one power, who fight the shadow, and who are willing to do whatever it takes to save the world. This lesson was a hard one for the Aes Sedai to learn. It was a lesson that came with pain and chaos, and in fighting, but it was a lesson that they needed to learn. And it was a lesson that only Cadsuane Melaidhrin could teach them. She tore down the old foundation of the White Tower, not to destroy it, but to rebuild it, to build a new White Tower, a tower that was stronger, more united, and more able to fight the shadow. A tower that was true to the Aes Sedai's original purpose, a tower that was a beacon of light in a dark world. The road to rebuilding would be long and hard, and the White Tower would never be the same again. But Cadsuane had given them the first step, a step that no one else had the courage to take. She had shattered the hierarchy of age and strength, and in doing so, she had given the Aes Sedai a chance to be great again.